The Wild West is often portrayed as a place of courage, adventure, and epic achievements, but the true history of the West goes beyond the legends we all know. While many remember cowboys facing the desert's dangers and Native Americans being subdued, few people know about the fierce resistance of the Xiximães, a Native American tribe forgotten by most, and the Cowgirls, women who defied a male-dominated society to conquer the West. What you know about these elements of history is about to be turned upside down. Today we'll uncover these hidden details and the forgotten figures who truly shaped the West, the ones who never received the attention they deserved. The resistance of the Xiximães is one of the greatest untold stories of the West. Amidst a sea of settlers arriving to claim the land, the Xiximães resisted with impressive ferocity and strategy. They not only faced the advances of the army, but also fought against diseases, misery, and the loss of their ancestral lands. With guerrilla tactics, they preserved their culture and way of life longer than many native peoples. But even with this resistance, they were forced to live in the shadows of history, forgotten by those who preferred to tell the version of the victors. On the other hand, cowgirls are perhaps one of the most underestimated figures in American history. They were not just partners to the cowboys. They often took the lead in moments of danger and adversity. Throughout the 19th century, women like Annie Oakley and Calamity Jane defied societal norms, demonstrating exceptional skills in shooting, horseback riding, and survival. These women stood out in a world that said a woman's place was at home, not in battle or on the cattle trails. They were not just peripheral figures in the history of the West. In fact, they were at the center of many of the great achievements of that era. The Xiximães were a Native American tribe whose resistance and culture were virtually erased by dominant historical accounts. Their story dates back to a time before the arrival of settlers, when they were masters in the strategic use of land and weapons. The way they lived in harmony with nature and the importance they placed on ancestral wisdom were factors that allowed them, for a time, to maintain their independence. However, the narrative of the West rarely mentions the Xiximães, preferring to focus on more visible figures like the Comanches or Apaches. What many don't know is that behind this invisibility, there existed a vibrant community, rich in traditions and fiercely protective of their lands. What the Xiximães achieved was remarkable. Not only did they resist the advance of colonial troops, but they also adapted to new forms of combat, using the terrain and natural knowledge for their guerrilla strategies. Their tactics were so effective that they often confounded even the best soldiers of the American army. With their deep understanding of the land, they used forests, rivers, and mountains as allies. Even under pressure and the growing threat of colonization, the Xiximães continued to resist for years, keeping their cultural and spiritual identity alive, but at a high cost: the loss of their lands and the extermination of many of their people. The story of the Xiximães is not just one of military resistance, but also of cultural preservation. They kept their traditions alive for generations, even when colonial forces tried to erase them. The hunting ceremonies, the stories told around campfires, and the connection with the spirits of the land were daily practices that provided cohesion and identity to the Xixim people. Their spirituality was deeply connected to the soil they walked upon, and that was one of the reasons they fought so fiercely to protect their land, culture, and future. These guerrillas and guardians of the land were far from invisible. They lived in the shadows of history, but their resistance and legacy remain alive. Even though their story was suppressed for so long, the Xiximães remained a symbol of courage, strength, and perseverance, leaving a lasting impact that still resonates today. Cowgirls were undoubtedly some of the most powerful figures in the American West, though their contributions have historically been minimized. In an era when women were often seen merely as caregivers of the home, cowgirls broke barriers and defied the expectations of society at the time. Alongside the cowboys, they were not just sidekicks but leaders and warriors who played essential roles in the advancement of the American frontier. They owned farms, drove herds, faced storms, and often dealt with the same adversities and dangers as their male counterparts, if not more. Figures like Annie Oakley and Calamity Jane stand out as historical icons, but their stories are much more complex than the romanticized versions we know. Annie Oakley was not just a talented marksman, but also a woman who defied gender norms by performing in shows for large crowds, demonstrating her extraordinary skills, and gaining respect in the shooting world. She not only broke records for accuracy, but also used her fame to fight for causes such as women's rights and better working conditions for Western laborers. Calamity Jane, on the other hand, stood out not only for her skill with weapons, but for the way she dressed and behaved in a world where women were not expected to exhibit such behavior. She had no fear of facing the dangers of the West, and her life was marked by bold actions, long travels, and the constant breaking of stereotypes. Jane was a controversial figure, both admired and criticized, but her courage and determination to live by her own rules made her a legend of the West. Cowgirls were not just secondary figures in the history of the West, as many might think. They were pioneers, trailblazers, who helped shape the future of this wild and unforgiving land. They faced enormous challenges from prejudice to the everyday dangers of the West. However, their resilience and skill proved that they were as indispensable as the cowboys in the advancement of civilization on the frontier. They became symbols of strength, resistance, and independence, inspiring not only other women, but all those who dreamed of a freer, limitless future. Although the Xiximães and cowgirls come from different worlds, their stories of resistance, courage, and the fight for survival intertwine in a fascinating way. Both groups lived in a brutal, unforgiving environment where daily adversities demanded immense strength just to survive, let alone thrive. While the Xiximães defended their lands with unwavering passion, the cowgirls faced societal barriers to prove their worth in a male-dominated world. And despite the difference in their social roles, both shared the indomitable spirit of those who refused to be defeated. The relationship between the Xiximães and the cowgirls can also be seen in how both cultures were deeply connected to the land. The Xiximães, with their profound respect for nature and ancestral knowledge, viewed the land as a living entity that needed to be respected and protected. On the other hand, the cowgirls, often responsible for driving herds, were immersed in the same challenging and unforgiving landscape. While shaped by different experiences, both figures saw themselves as protectors of the land, whether through warfare or cattle culture, and their bond with the land made them inseparable from it. Their connection to nature was a central factor in how both groups survived in such a vast and relentless territory. The cultural impact of the Xiximães and the Cowgirls on the West is a legacy that still resonates in American culture and collective imagination. Both figures represented a break from the norm. The Xiximães, who defied colonial advancement, and the Cowgirls, who challenged the idea that women couldn't live and thrive in the Wild West. Their stories shaped the legends of the West, and their legacies still inspire books, films, and even modern social movements. By revisiting these historical figures, we can better understand how, despite their differences, the Xiximães and the Cowgirls were essential in shaping the West as we know it, not only in resistance but in the formation of the identity and culture of this land. These two groups, the Xiximães and the Cowgirls, may not be frequently remembered in the more popular versions of Western history, but their importance is undeniable. They represented the indomitable spirit of a wild and unforgiving land, where only the strongest and most determined would survive. Today, more than ever, it is essential to give voice to these stories, which not only show us the past but also teach us powerful lessons about courage, resistance, and the fight for justice.